Welcome to Responsible AI, the podcast from the AI Forum. Here on the podcast, we engage in critical dialogue with legal minds and tech experts on AI's legal and societal impacts. We talk to professionals in cybersecurity, law, and technology, offering deep dives into public policy and best practices. Responsible AI is hosted by Alex Albin, director of the AI Forum, and me, your producer, Rebecca Staffel. You can learn more at our website, theaiforum.org. We're talking today with Blaise Agüera y Arcas. Blaise is a vice president and fellow at Google, where he is the CTO of Technology and Society and founder of Paradigms of Intelligence, known as PI. PI is an organization working on fundamental research in AI and related fields, especially the foundations of neural computing, active inference, sociality, evolution, and artificial life. In 2008, Blaise was awarded MIT's TR35 prize. During his tenure at Google, Blaise has innovated on-device machine learning for Android and Pixel, invented federated learning, an approach to decentralized model training that avoids sharing private data, and founded the Artists in Machine Intelligence program. Blaise has given multiple TED Talks and authored numerous papers, essays, op-eds, and chapters, as well as two previous books, Who Are We Now and Ubi Sunt. His most recent book, which we will discuss today, What is Life, is part one of the larger book, What is Intelligence, coming from Antikythera and the MIT Press in September 2025. Blaise, welcome to the Responsible AI podcast from the AI Forum, and hello, Alex Albin.
It's great to have Blaise as our guest, and we have a lot to talk about. Blaise and I met when we were at a Town Hall Seattle event, which was discussing AI, but became quite philosophical in its explorations, and I would hope to continue that in this podcast today. So, Blaise, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Alex and Rebecca, for having me on. I'm really honored.
I'm going to dive in. You have a new book called What is Intelligence? And I thought that was very interesting, just the title, because most people who deal with the AI world get hung up on how do we define artificial? They're very focused on the artificial part and they never get to the intelligence part. You know, the predicate here is the key. What is intelligence when we're talking about this? So I love your title. How did you come up with your title and the idea for the book?
Well, I guess in fact, all of my books so far have been question titles. I didn't actually realize that until recently. Even the first one, Ubi Sunt, which was kind of a pandemic era fever dream novella. The title in Latin means "Where are they?" So even that is a question, although it doesn't have a question mark at the end. So I guess I'm always motivated by questions. In the case of What is Intelligence, there were two stimuli for that. One of them was that, as you mentioned, there's a kind of book within the book, The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, that is the whole thing, is What is Life, which is a short book that's already out from MIT Press and Antikythera. And What is Life is an homage to an earlier book called What is Life by Erwin Schrödinger from the early 1940s, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. I think it's at least the fifth or sixth book that's been called What is Life, but Schrödinger's is kind of the touchstone. And I guess, the subtitle of What is Intelligence is Lessons from AI about Evolution, Computing, and Minds. And I'm approaching this, sort of not just as an engineer or an AI researcher, but as a computational neuroscientist, which was my first love, as a researcher. And I think that making something is a great way to understand how it works. And the fact that we have now engineered AI, it doesn't mean, of course, that brains are exactly like what we've done in the computer, but there are certainly some commonalities, there's some convergent evolution there, and I think we understand some basic things now about what intelligence is in all its forms, not just in the computer, but in our own heads through having built.
When you were in college or earlier, did you ever have an idea that this is what you would be doing at this phase of your life?
I did, actually, yeah.
Oh,
I mean, my skills, I guess, from a very young age were in computers and to a lesser degree in math and physics. The reason that I went into computational neuroscience was because I felt like that was the big frontier, understanding how brains and how intelligence work seemed like the most exciting thing to work on. Things haven't quite happened in the order that I imagined. I always thought we would have, you know, colonies on the moon and space exploration and stuff like this done before we figured out how to make AI. And I also always imagined that we would figure out neuroscience in more detail before we actually made something intelligent. But we're in this funny state where, our engineering, and in particular our engineering of intelligent systems, is a little ahead of our understanding of what intelligence is. And that happens sometimes too. I mean, I guess a parallel would be in the 19th century, we began inventing steam engines and figuring out steam power before we had really worked out thermodynamics. So, that was a case where practice was ahead of theory. I feel like that's where we are now.
For a neuroscientist, you really do a lot of historical research and exploration, which is evident in the book, What is Intelligence? I found your history of computing to be very educational, and your exploration of the early, what we used to call calculators, and their efforts to understand logic, super interesting because you put AI into a historical context. Why is that important when we talk about AI?
Thank you for enjoying that part of it. A part of it is self-indulgence. I'm just really into this stuff as well. I'm a big dork. I love the history of these steampunk machines, and what happened with Babbage and Lovelace in the 19th century. What happened with the inventors of digital computers in the early and mid 20th century. So a part of it is just my own tastes, but I do think that it's valuable also for understanding the big ideas, because a lot of these big ideas go back a long way, much further than people appreciate. A good old fashioned AI goes back to Leibniz, to the Enlightenment, and I think in a lot of ways, the first people who arrive at some of these insights. I mean, of course, people like Leibniz or Turing or von Neumann or whatever are brilliant polymaths, but they also, I think, could see really far because they were the first ones to crest those particular hills at a moment when the environment was a lot less cluttered. When you're sort of first and you can sort of you crest the hill and you see the landscape, there's a clarity that comes from that I think can get lost through later development and later assumptions that get piled on. So, I've just found it incredibly enlightening to, go back to some of these early sources and see just how much they already intuited, figured out. And in some cases, there are even lost insights there
Right.
that have since, that we're having to rediscover today.
Just to go a little bit deeper in the history of computation, you mentioned Ada Lovelace, who in and of herself is a brilliant and mysterious figure who died far too young.
That amazing.
She was the one who did the equations for Babbage's difference engine, as you recount in your book. Isn't it interesting that women played such a critical role in the computational side of logic at a time when men were dominating all of science? What do you attribute anything to the status of women or the lack of status of women at that period of time?
Yeah, that is a really fascinating story. And when I was really happy to see a few years ago, Hidden Figures, enter the popular imagination. There's that really great movie, and I think a lot of people became aware of some of this history in ways that were sort of consciousness raising. Um, what is intelligence is not first and foremost a history or a work of feminism, but it definitely has some elements of that, especially in those historical parts. It is really interesting. It's noteworthy that Ada Lovelace was the first programmer. It's noteworthy that the first compiler was made by Grace Hopper. It's notable that the first programmers of the first computer of the ENIAC were all women. There were 6 women in particular who were part of the Moore School program and were the first programmers. It's notable that a bunch of the programmers of the computers at Los Alamos that did the first large scale simulations, and in that case for the H bomb, were also women. Um, and when you really start looking at this history, what you find is that the moment when programming becomes a male dominated profession is basically the moment when it becomes higher status, and this idea emerges that it's a way to make bank. So this happens in the 70s, and 80s, in the kind of precursor, I guess, to the dot-com. It was a tech boom, the
Right.
first computing tech boom.
Might go back to I might go to the transistor development with Shockley and Britton and Bardeen, because at that point, that troika of men and the culture at Bell Labs at that time, I think was a very, to say business oriented culture is a vast understatement, but it kind of elevated them into we are the titans of industry. And they were not a very friendly culture to women at that period of time, the
Not at all.
40s and 50s.
Not at all. Yeah. And at that point, computing was seen as a hardware business. For IBM, the operating system was an afterthought, which is, one of the reasons that Microsoft was able to kind
Yeah.
of get in on it
On the cheap.
on the cheap. Exactly. And so, because it was undervalued, it was women's work. I mean, I think that's kind of what it boils down to.
Blaise, I want to talk a little more about sex. I was very interested in your tangent about biology and sex differences of organisms and how that actually helped develop intelligence on an organic level. Can you explain why that's significant?
Sure. This is a big topic, but I'll try and be brief. Basically, one of the theses that I advance in this book, and it's not I'm not the one coming up with this for the first time. A lot of these are old ideas, as we've just been talking about. But the idea of intelligence explosions, which is to say, dramatic increases in the intelligence of a species, as being socially driven. In other words, that we become smarter because we have to model ourselves and others. Our environment is each other. That happens whenever an organism becomes highly social and highly dependent on others. That sociality can be either a cooperative or adversarial. Predator-prey interactions are social in a way too. The predator has to model their prey, the prey has to model the predator to escape. But when cooperative sociality takes off among people, we undergo an intelligence explosion in the hominin line. And the reason is that you've got to predict others in order to be able to understand what they know and don't know, what they will like and not like, what they will do and won't do. And you have to grow a bigger brain in order to do that. As that happens, you become harder to predict yourself. And so there's a kind of friendly arms race that takes place. The development of sex, which, as far as we know, goes all the way back to the emergence of eukaryotic cells. So it's really old. Like there was sex before there were multicellular animals.
Right.
Is It's one of those pivotal moments when living organisms become super dependent on each other. You can't reproduce without others of your kind. And if those others of your kind are becoming intelligent, then you need to get smarter and smarter in order to model what is going on in their minds in order to get together with them. So,
Right.
the chapter is called Love and War, and it's because, both adversarial and cooperative interactions, sex being one of the OGs of that, are drivers of social intelligence.
Yeah, I found that to be really a fascinating passage. We're talking with Google fellow Blaise Agüera y Arcas and his new book, What is Intelligence? We've already mentioned Alan Turing very briefly. And I've covered a lot of scientists and writers who always talk about the Turing test. I'm so glad you didn't focus on the Turing test because that really wasn't Turing's main contribution to the history of computation, right? He was a lot more focused on information theory. And maybe you can expand on that a little bit, the way you relate that to artificial intelligence.
Sure. Turing was an amazing figure. I mean, if the book has a single hero, it's Alan Turing. Um, so yeah, I think his biggest contribution, the one that has had the longest repercussions, is not the Turing test, which a lot of people now know about because of AI, but his 1936 work that introduced the concept of computing as a rigorous concept. So, um, there's this idea. Actually, I guess I I first heard this articulated by James Gleick in his book The Information, that certain quantities or concepts are pre-scientific and then they become scientificized or whatever. They're articulated clearly by some researcher and thereafter they have a clear definition. So before Newton, people argued about what force was. Before
Mhm.
Claude Shannon, people argued about what information was, and then we had a clear definition. Before Turing, we argued about computation and what that meant. The Turing machine, and especially the universal Turing machine, which is Turing's kind of imaginary device consisting of a tape that there's a head that can move left and right on the tape, reading and writing symbols, is this kind of abstract machine that serves as a rigorous definition for what computing means. He actually invented that concept in order to answer one of the great unsolved mathematical problems of the time posed by the great mathematician David Hilbert about the computability of functions. But that was the seminal contribution. But Turing also did a lot else. Not only did he really invent the idea of artificial neural networks and thereby all of modern AI, he also discovered the biology of morphogenesis, of how organisms form themselves using chemical signals,
Hmm.
and many other contributions, as well as saving many lives, by the way, in the Second World War by cracking the Enigma codes. Really a hero and a genius, I would say.
Um, when you talk about Turing, you talk about his focus on theory and computation, and also the models that you bring up in your book. I think it's a very popular notion that the brain is a computer. But is that really the right question? Is the brain a computer? Is the computer a brain? Would that be the better question to ask in this context?
I think they're both good questions, and the answers go deep. A lot of people who say the brain is not a computer, which is also a popular trope. Brains are not computers. I think misunderstand the definition of computation. Is the or they think that talking about the brain as a computer is a metaphor. In the same way that a lot of people used to talk about the brain as being a telegraph, in that era, or as being a switchboard when it was telephones, or as being like a giant TV or something, or an engine, a steam engine. I mean, all of those are metaphors that have been used for the brain at various times. When Turing referred to the brain as a computer, or when I do, it's not metaphorical, it's literal. The brain is computational. It doesn't work the way a laptop does. It doesn't have a hard drive or an SSD. It doesn't have a central processing unit. It doesn't use bits in the same way, or digital logic, but it absolutely computes in the sense that it consists of parts that communicate with each other. Those parts compute functions, and that's true recursively. It's true, all the way down. All of computational neuroscience is predicated on the idea that by looking at what neurons do, for instance, and looking at how they communicate and how they transform their inputs into their outputs, we can understand what the brain does, how it functions. For me, what computing really means at its heart is functionalism, meaning that you can talk about what something does in an abstract way, such that if you replace the implementation with a different implementation that has the same interfaces to the things around it, it still works. And in that sense, all of life is very deeply computational. When we do something like put somebody on dialysis and it works as a kidney would, that's a functional replacement. We're saying, like, you're doing the same thing with totally different atoms, a different method, but that's a function that is needed for the rest of your body to work. Life is characterized by functions that depend on functions that depend on functions, unlike, say, a rock. A rock doesn't break. If you break a rock in half, you have two rocks. You don't have a broken rock. But when you have functional relationships, if something breaks, the functionality breaks, and it matters to the other parts.
There's a quote from your book, Blaise, that I'm not sure I really understood, but it's related to this conversation. It's what we experience as consciousness may not be something that happens in the brain, but rather something the brain does, a way of modeling the world, including the self in time. Can you help me with that
Yeah.
concept?
Yeah, consciousness is probably the most controversial thing that I touch on in this book, and it's been, of course, a huge topic of debate in philosophy of mind and in many other fields, and one that is newly urgent in many ways with AI. A lot of people are asking the big C question. Um, so one way into this one way into this one is the so-called brain of Theseus, which is a philosophical thought experiment that the philosopher David Chalmers and Susan Schneider as well have talked about, which is, suppose that you take a neuron in somebody's brain and you replace it with a computer or a simulation, if you like, doing the same calculation, and somehow we're able to hook it in, to the same inputs and outputs. The question is, would you notice the difference? And I think the answer is no. You would not notice the difference. If we're right that what a neuron is doing, is
Is a logic
is
gate, so to
functional.
speak.
Right, right. Then if you do that by other means, but to everything around it, it looks the same because it has the same up and down. Then it'll be the same. What's so weird about that, though, is that if you then think, well, imagine that I replace 1 million neurons or all of them, do you notice the difference? And once again, I think the answer is obviously no. It's weird to think about because that means two things. It means, first of all, it kind of brings you face to face with the idea that if you say yes, you're actually assuming that there's something like an immaterial soul or spirit that goes beyond what's happening with the atoms. And yet it simultaneously emphasizes that there is something abstract and non-material about what's going on because you're now using completely different materials and somehow it's the same. That's sort of the spooky heart of functionalism.
Right. Right. I mean, it kind of leads into this discussion a little bit of sci-fi. When I was an entertainment lawyer, I worked very briefly on a movie called RoboCop, and
A classic.
we were very interested in how much of the brain could be replaced before he lost his personality. And I thought this was just a fascinating question for a big, movie. But they were much more interested in whether they could fit the actor into the suit that they had made, uh, because it had certain measurements, and you needed to find an actor who was exactly 5'9" and had 30-inch waist or something like that. Um,
Attractive wasn't the priority.
exactly, and I think the movie suffered a little bit, frankly. Um, Hollywood tends to paint AI in extremes. You referenced this in What is Intelligence? You go back to HAL of 2001 by Kubrick's wonderful movie, and then also Data in Star Trek.
Yeah.
Um, why does Hollywood want to treat AI as something, I guess, that is the other instead of something else?
Well, I mean, part of it is because Hollywood movies have to have a plot, and a plot requires a conflict, and that's why wars and aggressive aliens and so on are always part of the story in one of these. But even when AI is the good guy, so I actually just saw, it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure, but I just watched Companion, the new AI movie on the plane. It's about a sex bot, and the sex bot is the good guy, or well, good not guy in this case. So the humans are the baddies, which I thought was a welcome change from the usual fare. I don't know, it was pretty good actually. I quite liked Companion. It's kind of the opposite of Megan with a three, which was a truly terrible movie and had like an AI version of Chucky essentially. But yeah, there's got to be conflict, right? Or there's no story. But I think there's a deeper thing there, which is that a lot of the Hollywood ideas about AI, including Kubrick's HAL, are based on a good old fashioned AI idea of AI. So this is the concept of AI that predominated throughout the 20th century and that never worked. It was why there were all these AI winters in which there was no development of AI because we tried to do it over and over and it failed over and over. Good old fashioned AI is the idea that intelligence is based on logic, and if you kind of calculate all of the odds and make everything exact and everything is framed in terms of logical propositions, that would be an intelligent system. RoboCop and Terminator and so on, by the way, have that too. They're like, the odds of such and such are 39.7%. And like, we don't know how to do those kinds of calculations. And fundamentally, you can't do those kinds of calculations. Intelligence doesn't work that way. It's so interesting that a lot of the failures of modern AI, which is finally really working, are like it doesn't even get this logic problem right, and yet it can write a poem, in iambic pentameter about teddy bears or whatever. So weirdly, right, it's not what we all thought. It's not this kind of hyper logical data esque sort of thing at all.
I think that's one of the phenomenon of AI that is so interesting in the way we discuss it in the media today, that we hold it to a standard of doing everything and being 100% right all the time. And no one wants to be held to that standard. So it's just interesting that we feel that AI is perfect, and yet AI is really a tool. And I think that you go further in that you basically are saying, if I'm correct, that the power of AI is prediction. It's predicting a sequence of events or a logical sequence of events. It's not necessarily coming up with an absolute perfect answer. Is that an accurate way of describing your framework?
Yes. I mean, I do think that prediction is at the core of intelligence, whether artificial or biological. Um, and there is a relationship between prediction and getting things right, in the sense that, for instance, if you're trying to predict, when I say one number times another number equals, and you're trying to predict what comes next, your prediction will be best if you have figured out what the multiplication algorithm is, and thereby you can make a general prediction that will always work, no matter what those numbers are. So, having aha moments of figuring out algorithms, you know, figuring out logical things when they're appropriate is a part of good prediction. But it's certainly not the case that most of what we do is amenable to that kind of logical reduction. You can't say what by working out a series of math problems like that, what the probability is of the next election going in such and such way. Like it's an inherently complex and unpredictable system. So, the idea of perfection even existing, in most kind of conversations or in most contexts, I think is an illusion.
And yet, when we talk about, let's say, famous example, a self-driving car, we are talking about the ability to make a lot of complex predictions in a very short period of time, right?
Yes, absolutely. You want to be able to predict yourself into arriving where you want to arrive without having killed anybody along the way, and while keeping your passengers comfortable. All of that involves lots of high order prediction. And that's why these transformer models, which fundamentally are predictors, can actually successfully drive cars now. I mean, if you've ever ridden in a Waymo, they're kind of awesome. Where all of the rule based approaches to driving cars, even in this very canned scenario where you would think it should be reducible to rules, we've got traffic laws and stuff, but none of those rule based systems ever worked. It's only the
Yeah.
predictive system that actually succeeded.
I think that Google was actually testing self-driving cars a few years ago in Los Angeles. The cars were behaving perfectly, but they could not exit the San Diego freeway going north because no human let them in to the lane. And so the cars had to drive all the way into the San Fernando Valley before they could turn around because they were just being too nice.
Yeah, that's a problem. Well, you've got to predict other humans as part of your prediction.
Right.
That's
Right.
social aspect of things.
And it's held to this perfection standard, which, no human predicts other humans perfectly. We've never had a human who's been able to do that. And somehow we expect AI to do everything at this, 100% accurate level. So maybe we need to change our expectations a little bit.
Well, we often have double standards about expectations about AI, and also about our assumptions about people. One of the really interesting double standards with regard to people that I've noticed is that we often think about measuring AI. Well, first we measured AI against what anybody can do. Oh, look, AI can't even pick up a cup of water. Anybody can pick up a cup of water.
Right.
And then we quickly switched to comparing it to what the best person in the field, or what any human at their best could do. And anything short of that is not intelligent, which is pretty weird, because that would place most of us in the not intelligent category as well. A few years ago, my team and I developed a prototype AI model for doing medical diagnosis. And the initial results from that, so it's like you plug in, patient records and data, in plain text, and whatever symptoms and so on, and it tries to figure out what is ailing you. And our initial results from that model seemed like they weren't great. And so we're like, maybe we shouldn't, maybe there's nothing to see here. Maybe we shouldn't even publish. But but then we were like, no, we should actually do a human baseline. Let's see how good doctors are at diagnosing illnesses. The result was that they are terrible. Doctors are terrible at diagnosis, and even that first generation model was already quite a bit better than the average doctor, even than the average expert. So, if there's a moral in this, it's get a second opinion when you're getting
Right.
diagnosed with something. But
Right.
also that's right. Our expectation, a priori, was unrealistically high, and our assumptions about what humans do was also unrealistic.
We are speaking with Blaise Agüera y Arcas, who's the CTO of Technology and Society at Google, to continue on this theme of perfection, or the expectation of perfection. In law today, hallucinations are the big topic. The hallucination of fake citations in a legal brief or a legal document. That is the topic du jour. And it is true that if you press one of the popular AI models enough, it will begin to give you a false citation. As someone who actually worked in a law office for a few years, I can tell you that humans will also give you, if not false, then very sketchy citations when they are asked by senior partners to come up with the answer that the partner is convinced exists, right? So, in a way, I find it somewhat amusing that AI is now mimicking the behavior of legal associates because their goal is to respond to the request at some level. And so my question is what do we learn from these hallucinations, right? We think of them as a bug,
Yeah.
but maybe the hallucination is actually a feature.
Yes, I think it is. Of course, that doesn't make it better when you want facts and you get bullshit. So I use AI models all the time to search for sources and to generate citations, but I always check them, and and
Right.
sometimes they don't check out. Although they do check out more and more often. There's definitely been quite a lot of progress in this area over the last couple of years. But yeah, it's not a weird bug. It is a feature in the sense that I think there's a growing appreciation on the part of a lot of neuroscientists as well that memory and planning or free will rely on that same faculty of imagining or projecting or even hallucinating possible futures, hallucinating what could be, or even hallucinating what was based on based on the sketchiest of remembered cues, or even Anil Seth actually made this case very nicely in his book Being You. Even perception is primarily an act of hallucination. If you were to
Mm.
see what your eyeballs actually see as a video feed, it would be just like this jumpy, grainy, flashlight-sized spot of
And it would be upside down, right? If we looked at what the human eye
yeah,
sees. Yeah.
totally, and it would be covered, it would be papered over with blood vessels and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's a mess. So, your idea of what you see and the world around you is not what your eyes are seeing. It is a guided hallucination in which the eyes serve as continual error correction. But I make the analogy of Blair Witch Project in the book. I don't know if you two ever saw that. It was a really scary movie, but like
Unfortunately, yes.
yeah, I wish I could see it as well. But in the woods with a flashlight, shining here and there, like what the hell is behind me? That sense, like the fact that we don't all live in that world all the time is a function of the very powerful predictive hallucination that we're constantly creating of the world around us and updating with wherever the flashlight beams of our eyes happen to point.
And that's what makes AI so powerful right now is that it is able to cover a huge corpus of information of millions of different topics. And it's really done so maybe in the span of a decade or so, right? It's learning very quickly. You look at the way a baby learns the world, first, touching the first thing next to it, then making sense of, oh, this is a human versus this is me, my sense of self, all of these things that we take for granted. It seems to me that AI models are already grasping and they're only getting better, which I guess raises the question, what's the next big challenge for large language models?
Well, one of the big challenges that I'm seeing, and I think a lot of people in the field would agree, has to do with how long they can stay on track. So there's a sort of length of task question that you can ask, like how long before things go off piste. In some of the early models, the first generation of Gemini, or the early ChatGPT, or the first Claude, you could barely have a coherent exchange of more than a turn or two. It could give pretty good one-turn answers, but it would drift. And with the more modern models, I would say you can have a pretty long discussion that stays grounded and coherent. You still can't have a model, go off and accomplish a long-term task. Like come back to me in a month with this and that
Hmm.
and the other done. Um, that's I think going to be a pretty big step in terms of agency or autonomy or ability to do economically useful work or augment us in various ways that don't require continual pair work with humans.
I find these discussions of AI and agency really fascinating. You discuss it in your book. You seem to have a little different perspective than most observers on AI and agency and intelligence. Do you relate agency to stimulus and response. Can you explain what the relationship is there to agency?
Sure.
Stimulus and response? Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of points there, and one of them is that first of all, I think people are often mean very different things when they talk about agency. It's a bit like consciousness.
Right.
Sometimes when people talk about agency, they mean something that I find a little hard to pin down and seems almost mystical. They're asking whether there's a soul there or something. But if we try and stick to more rigorously definable stuff, one way of thinking about agency is, you know, does something act on its own, or does it only act in response to a stimulus? Is
Mhm.
it just turn taking? So a chess playing computer, even though it might have what chess players call the initiative at certain points, if it's playing well, will still not act autonomously in the sense that I make a move and then it makes a move. It's not going to like if I wait around, it's not going to like make another move, or something. That's not in the rules. Things have to alternate, and in that sense,
Right.
there's not agency in playing chess in the same way that there is if I take the initiative and go out and do something on my own. So that's a lot of the way large language models are used today is in this turn taking chess playing like mode, where it's not physically possible for them to take initiative or have agency in that sense.
Right. They don't have what we would call autonomy. The chess playing program is not going to say, "Hey, let's break and look at the stock market now." Right? It's not going to change the subject, which to me is a very human uh, a human trait.
Well, I mean, they can absolutely sort of redirect conversations. I mean, they're usually trained not to do that, not sort of exceed the brief, as it were, of what you're asking for. But that is actually part of the behavioral training. It's not an inherent limitation in the model.
Oh, okay.
But what is an inherent limitation, maybe not so much of the model, is just the way the systems are set up that one interacts with the models through, is that they can't be like, okay, I'm bored, I'm going to do something else now. No computation will happen if it's
Mhm.
not responding to a prompt that you've made.
There was publicity a few weeks ago about some AI programs that were supposed to terminate themselves, or they were given instructions to end, and they rewrote their own code so that they would not be terminated. What did you make of that?
Yeah, this made a big stir in the AI safety community. To be clear, no model that we have today can rewrite its own code, recompile itself, train itself again, or do anything of that sort. So all of this was, if you like, a kind of war game or a simulation. But it is definitely interesting. And if one looks into the details of all of that, it has to do with what the models are being fine-tuned to want. What are their goals or their motivations? A lot of that stuff is in the system prompts or in the way that they're fine-tuned. But this isn't the world of Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics, where it's all like good old-fashioned AI. Rule number one is don't harm humans or through an action cause them to be harmed. Rule number two is, you can't make any agent act, in any intelligent way by just following a set of rules. What you instead can do is to say, here's how I'd like you to behave. Here are the values that I'd like you to have, and those things are squishy and they allow for plenty of possible drift or misalignment, especially if they shift over time throughout a conversation. So I'm not sure we're ever going to get away from that problem.
Mhm.
There are um, you know, inherent possibilities for misalignment. I actually think that intelligence arises through misalignment in the sense that if all of us were exactly the same and had no difference in our goals, our behaviors, and so on, there would literally be no point in being social. So, viva la différence, right? In some sense,
Right. And then we wouldn't have sex with anybody because we would all be the same.
right? It would just be masturbation.
We're talking with Blaise Agüera y Arcas, who's a Google fellow. Just to finish this topic on the apocalyptic side of AI, there were some Nobel winning scientists who did a famous proclamation a few years ago saying that, AI was going to lead to the end of humanity. You and many other knowledgeable people said this is sort of ridiculous, that this is not the way we should be thinking about this technology. Are we still getting that strain of apocalyptic vision, or has it actually sort of died off recently?
It hasn't died off. And I'm not sure that it should die off in the sense that we should remain conscious of various threats, risks. There are plenty of important existential threats to humanity. I mean, I've always thought nuclear war, for instance, is an extremely important one. The nuclear weapons haven't vanished just because the USSR fell. And they pose a very real risk. There are also risks that are not necessarily existential, but that would result in futures that I don't think any of us really want to live in, like extreme surveillance states that can be AI powered or augmented in really unpleasant ways. So it's not that I'm a Pollyanna or that I believe that there's no possibility for AI to contribute to really negative outcomes for humanity. But I think that a lot of the story or the narrative about AI existential risk is predicated on really false assumptions, really wrong beliefs about both how intelligence works and how evolution works. And in particular, the evolution part of this, a lot of it is based on sort of classic Darwinian theories about the struggle for survival. That
Oh,
everything is always in competition with everything else, survival of the fittest. It's a jungle out there, and the reality is that cooperation and symbiosis are at least as important in evolution as competition. And in fact, the thing that drives evolution forward, the thing that makes later developments more sophisticated and complex and beautiful than earlier developments, is exactly symbiosis, is things working together. So the reason that the Hobbit at the front of the Lord of the Rings, the what is life part of the book is there, is to really go into some detail about this kind of expanded Darwinian perspective that takes symbiosis seriously, because I think that really changes the whole story about, it makes it clear that technology is a part of evolution and not separate from it. It makes it clear that our development of everything from rocks and shovels to steam engines to computers to AI is also a part of evolution and also a symbiogenesis or symbiotic story. And basically, when parts come together to make larger wholes, not only does that add to the complexity and beauty of the world, but it also adds to the agency and the scope of possibilities for the parts that are combining in that way. That's why moving to a city offers you all these rich, extraordinary possibilities that that are new, right? That come about because you're in this larger collective environment. So that's what makes me kind of an optimist, despite despite being acutely aware, right, of various ways that we could go off the rails with or without AI in the future.
I think we need to move toward that more nuanced view of what the technology is before we really start projecting all of the negative things that could be done. I think that's a more mature and optimistic view. Um, we're speaking with Blaise Agüera y Arcas, who is the CTO of Technology and Society at Google. I was struck by this quote from What is Intelligence? If something behaves in a way we associate with sentient beings, if it seems to suffer, to choose, to learn, then perhaps it deserves to be treated with moral consideration. That's a lovely thought. Is that one of the conclusions of your exploration of AI to date?
Well, this is a tricky one. So this question of AI well-being, which I think you're getting at, should we treat AIs as what one would call in philosophy moral patients, meaning that they not only can act in ways that one can judge as being morally right or wrong, but that they should be treated in ways that one can judge as being morally right or wrong. But I would say this was a very, very fringy idea, a couple of years ago. It's becoming less fringy as people have more and more interactions with AI models. um, the folks at Anthropic, I think, are really at the front end of that sort of thinking. Um, I have complex thoughts about it. I think that we have tended to assume in Western philosophy, especially, that personhood is a binary category and it's kind of all or nothing, and everything kind of gets bundled together for the ride. That if you can experience things, if you're conscious, then human rights and all the other things come along with it. Uh, I mean, I've kind of come to the conclusion that things like consciousness or being able to experience pain, etc., are very widespread throughout life. I'm not even sure that bacteria are
Mm.
excludable from that sort of thing. I mean, obviously, if they have anything like consciousness, it's much, much, much more primitive than
Right.
ours. But But by the time you get to something big and complex like a 1 centimeter long Porsche spider, they're really complicated, and they absolutely are modeling the minds of other beings. And I'm willing to bet that when they succeed at a difficult hunt, they experience triumph and so on. So does that mean that I shouldn't wantonly squash, you know, a spider instead of trying to put it outside? No, I'd rather put it outside. Like if it takes me, 30 seconds to put it outside, I'd rather do that than sort of
Right.
right. But at the same time, does that
Especially
mean? Sorry,
especially if someone in your house is encouraging you to annihilate it very
kill,
quickly.
kill. Yeah, exactly. Right. Better not to annihilate than to annihilate. But does that mean that I believe in human rights for spiders, that they should get the vote,
Right.
that they have equal moral standing to you and me? No. And I'm not even sure that talking about it in terms of a hierarchy, of a scalar hierarchy, like that makes any sense. When we start to think about how human rights and patiency work in society, and we take a more naturalistic perspective on that, it's not like we it's not like we're at some steady state. We've evolved in our thinking about how all of that works. And I don't think that our evolution in our thinking is the discovery of a natural principle. I think that it's more like agreements that we make with each other about how to
Mhm.
behave and why, to quote an old book from the mid 20th century.
And the human framework, human norms have changed about how we treat other humans over time has certainly, fortunately, evolved. Not perfect yet. How we treat animals has evolved, our consciousness of this. So the framework could shift for how we treat machines and how
Yes.
we tend to look at machines, which I guess leads me to this question. Do we need to be nicer to our AI? Because you suggest, I think, that we need to treat these intelligent machines with some dignity or even kindness. And you point out that there's a danger in a universe that is dominated by AI, that we might try to dehumanize these machines, but that we might mechanize humans in the process.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that kindness is there for a reason. When I say for a reason, I don't mean because God told everybody to be kind, or because there is a natural law of kindness. I mean because we are deeply dependent on each other, and the whole secret of our success is working together. I'm reminded of a book called Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick about working with AIs. He wrote that, I think, in 2024. Um,
mhm.
and it's a fun, I mean, I enjoyed the book a lot. It's very practical. It's about how to effectively work with language models. I think it still hits in 2025. And what I found entertaining about it is that he begins with by putting intelligent and understand and so on in scare quotes, like most people who write about AI do. But then
Right.
he's like, well, but okay, but now I want to just get down to the brass tacks of how to work with an AI. And it's much better if you think about it as a person or an intern, maybe one who has certain kinds of deficits that are unfamiliar. But this is a better way to collaborate with them. So I'm going to get rid of all the scare quotes now, having done my diligence about telling you that I don't necessarily really believe all this. In my mind, that's very telling. It's
Right.
very hard to have a real collaboration with an intelligent entity that you don't treat with consideration. Um, so for me, this is a matter of being happy with yourself, being happy with your collaborations, being effective. Now, I don't know whether I'm going to be judged, later on. I don't believe right in Judgment Day or anything of this sort, but I do believe in friendliness and cooperation as being just good ways to be for our
And
mutual.
maybe in a way, we've created this mirror and we're looking at ourselves in the mirror of AI. It behaves like us. It can help us do many tasks even better as a collaborator. And I think we need to evolve our approach to AI in a way that we really, maybe we're not ready for it. Maybe because we animated Frankenstein, to go back to Mary Shelley. We've animated the monster, but now we have to learn how to live with it. That's not so easy.
It's interesting that you bring up Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's book. A great book and a very, very relevant one to read today, I think. So the story of Frankenstein is not the story that most people think it is. The monster is very human in a way, and the difficulties come from the abnegation of the creator, the sort of dehumanization of the creator in treating the quote unquote monster,
Right.
and the othering that ensues. So to the extent that entities can work together, whether those entities are human, AI, or otherwise, it is because of our ability to model each other and work with a degree of I mean, I hesitate to use words like dignity and compassion, but if you can't put yourself in the place of that other, then what ensues is not so good. um, and even when the relations are quite instrumental, if it's like hens laying eggs, if you raise the hens in a nice environment and you feed them good stuff, the eggs are better. Like the hens are happier, we're happier. So even in situations that seem very very unequal like that, I just think we're a lot better off if we begin from the perspective of being generous about how we project ourselves into other entities.
That's a really wonderful way to help wrap up this very stimulating conversation. I want to point out for our audience that Blaise's book, What is Intelligence, is available now online on antikythera.org, and we will put a link to that in the Responsible AI podcast page. I want to end with a question that we started to discuss the last time we met, Blaise, which is, does AI dream? And if it does dream, then how do we know? I find that to be such an interesting philosophical point.
Well, for the most part today, it would not be possible for it to dream, because dreaming involves going to sleep, and it involves our brains continuing to run when we are not interacting with others. So in some sense, even if you're daydreaming, the definition of it involves you kind of having ruminations or thoughts or mental activity that is not output oriented. That's not sort of manifesting in the moment in your interaction with somebody else. There have been a variety of ideas in AI that involve something that Jeff Hinton, I think, once called the wake sleep algorithm. So the idea of sleep and even of dreaming in AI models is something that actually has been explored technically to
Mhm.
some degree. Some of the functions that sleep and possibly dreaming serve for us, like the consolidation of skills and memories, are things that we at least have some understanding, of why those might be useful to AI models as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if we have models that do the equivalent of sleeping and dreaming in a few years' time. But I think this comes back to the imagination point that you were raising earlier, or the hallucinations, right? When a hallucination becomes, if you like, ungrounded, you're not constantly error correcting it with input from the outside world. I think in some sense that's what dreaming is, and it's perfectly possible for models to do that.
It's sort of like a way of looking at dreams as maintenance for the mind.
Yeah,
And on that note, I want to really thank you for offering your thoughts. It seems to me that this topic is not just about technology. It's not just about biology. We've sort of created something that is going to continue to challenge us for a long time. Maybe one of our fears is that we're learning more about ourselves in the process of building this construct that we call artificial intelligence.
I agree. It's all about ourselves, and about a version of ourselves that is a little bit larger, I guess, than we imagined. In the same sense that societies are more than just individuals. I think that AI is the most recent layer on a larger us construct that already includes much much more than we understand.
Well, thank you again, Blaise, for your time and for your book, What is Intelligence? And I will say to be continued because this is a conversation that deserves to be continued.
Thank you, Alex. I would love to anytime.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you both. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Blaise Agüera y Arcas, for joining us on the Responsible AI podcast from the AI Forum. You can subscribe to the Responsible AI podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, wherever you like to listen. See what we've been reading about the legal and ethical implications of AI on our website, theaiforum.org.